Thank you for your invitation. Very, very kind invitation. I know you are very busy. Businessmen are busy by definition. So I know how time is important for you. I try to be short and try to ask your questions because I look at you and see in your faces you have questions to ask about Portugal, politically speaking, economically speaking, socially speaking. I'm not speaking of the past. You know that Portugal was the first country in the world to recognize the United States independence. It was a long, long time ago. Ever since we've been friends, allies. And there is an external policy in Portugal which is not only European, not only Portuguese-speaking, but Atlantic. Portugal belongs to NATO, and we accomplish our missions every day as President of the Republic and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. I'm very much involved in decisions connected with NATO, both in the eastern flank of Europe and in the southern flank. We are worried about it, very worried with Ukraine and with the Near and Middle East, but also with Northern Africa and Central Africa, where migration starts. Millions and millions of people that really are intending to make their way to Northern Africa and then to the Mediterranean Sea and to Southern Europe. So, speaking of the past is meaning we have very good ties, politically, economically, socially, and culturally. That's the reality. It doesn't depend upon the presidents or the governments. We have a constitution that is celebrating 40 years. I voted the constitution when I was much younger, as you may guess. And ever since, we've been really a trustable friend and ally of the United States. Whenever it was needed, we're there. It was in the past, it's in the present, it will be in the future. It is politically, it's military, it is economically, it's socially, it's financially. Well, but then, as I said, I look at your faces and I see there are several questions you want me to answer. First one is how Portugal is facing European situation nowadays. That's vital for our economy. Cannot hide that reality. Well, Europe is facing a difficult period for several reasons. Not only refugees and migrations, not only the problems with the Russian Federation concerning a new relationship, politically speaking and geostrategically speaking, but also dealing with growth, social justice, of course, and the relationship in the future with the United Kingdom. First of all, growth. Growth because Europe is really growing, but less than what was expected. Around 1.6, 1.5, that's really not what one should intend to be the best, even for Portugal, for all countries, all European countries, but also for those countries that depend very much in its trade from Europe. Second, if there is no growth, not enough growth, you'll be suffering, socially speaking. And that's the second problem of Europe. A third problem of Europe is we're going to start our negotiations, we don't know yet, with the United Kingdom. It depends upon the United Kingdom, because it's up to the United Kingdom to decide the timing of the start of negotiations. Either they invoke the Article 50 of the treaty or not. And it will be a long talk, an important talk for both of us. In the case of Portugal, I think this is the oldest ally we have for over 700 years. So we have bilateral relationship with the United Kingdom. We pay very much attention to the outcome of those negotiations. So you see that the environment in Europe is always important for peace, for balancing geostrategical situation in the world, mostly in what concerns Africa and the Middle East, but in a situation that is no longer, at least for the moment being, the situation we were facing 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Then second question you would like to ask me is, what about political stability in Portugal? Not in Europe, but in Portugal. My answer is very simple. We have a constitution. It's a constitution, a democratic constitution, semi-presidentialist constitution, where there is a balance of power between President of the Republic, Prime Minister, and Parliament. And we have now a stable situation. A new government was formed after the elections of October last year, and we have a government with a majority in the Parliament. It's a minority government, but with a majority support in the Parliament. And then we have the opposition, the former government in the opposition. And the President plays the role of not only controlling the way the Constitution is being respected with the Constitutional Court, but at the same time following very carefully what's been done in economy, in social politics, and in foreign policy. Foreign policy, there are no changes at all. The same foreign policy is there. But then what about your economic and financial situation? That is the third question. Of course, you're stable. There is no crisis. We shall have elections, local elections next year, by the end of next year in October, not before. No parliamentary elections, no presidential elections. We just have both of them. That's enough. We have, as you know, 4 years term for Parliament and a 5 years term for President, a little bit longer than in the United States. And the President can be re-elected if he runs again, of course. Well, what about economics and finance? We have commitments towards the European Union, financial commitments. We have signed, we have ratified, we have adopted the treaties, and we have voted a budgetary treaty. So I have a financial compromise. That means we must control our state deficit. That's simple. It doesn't depend upon the government, upon the Prime Minister, upon a President of the Republic. So what must we do this year? We must achieve the goal of 2.5% of deficit. And that's what will happen. Looking at the way things are doing, I would say that as it's happening in most European countries, our growth rate is more than 1%, but less than what was expected, 1.8. Some people say in the European Commission 1.4, but from 1 to 1.4, it will be our growth rate. Why? Why? Because there's other European countries, but with specific reasons, our exports suffered from the situation of some emergent economies. Well, it was the case of Angola. It was the case of Brazil. So it is not mostly the European trade that suffered. It was the non-European trade that suffered. The same way with investment. For two reasons. Because one of the ways of achieving our deficit is cutting public investment. We had to control it. And on the other hand, because private direct investment decreased a little bit, as in other European countries. And internal consumption was not enough to balance the situation. So economically, we have an evolution that is an evolution not so optimistic as the one we intended to have, but enough to keep our promise and our compromise of achieving the 2.5 this year and next year. Next year, we are about to prepare to vote the budget for next year. It will be presented by the government till October the 15th. And there the goal is to decrease the deficit, to have it around 1.5%, less 1 point than this year. That's the reason why, in a way, one had to cut public expenditure. It was needed, mostly current expenditure. And at the same time, of course, looking carefully at the way we must reform our state, because we're needing some structural reforms in local power, in regional power, in central administration. And that's one of the aims for next year, the following years, looking at the policies of this government, of any government in Portugal. Does it mean no social justice? Not necessarily. Some measures were taken to try to compensate those that had suffered during the 4 years crisis, 2011 till 2015. I'm thinking of civil servants. I'm thinking of social security, of some very low public wages. So in a sense, always very carefully, not to have negative collateral effects in our economy, and at the same time, not to increase expenditure we want to cut. So, of course, the question is it a very different policy from the previous government? There are differences. That's democratic alternative. I mean, you have different ideas, you have different solutions, you have different policies. But in what concerns financial objectives, and speaking of internal and external financial objectives, I'm also thinking of the balance of payments, where we decrease exports, but we decrease much more the imports. So the idea is not to change, which is structurally important and vital for Portugal. Important for our relationship with the European Union, important for our relationship with the foreign investors, and also with internal investors. Sometimes people ask, and what about the United States? Before answering that question, I'm going to tell you something. It's funny that at the same time, our economy is, as some of the European economies, facing new challenges. We have signs of hope. The fact that we're going to have the Web Summit very soon in Portugal, not in Dublin, coming from Dublin to Portugal till 2018. We have a movement, startup companies connected with universities, with young people, young generations. An important part of our immigration, recent immigration of the years of the crisis, is going back to Portugal. It's a curious immigration, no longer an immigration that leaves for years and years or decades. No, they go and come back. They have very short periods outside the country. 8 months, 1 year, 1 year and a half. Most of them are preparing their postgraduate studies, PhDs, or specializing abroad. And the fact that this new economy is appearing all over the country is a good sign, because it means future. Another good sign, tourism. This year is a record year. And we are rediscovering tourism we had lost. It's the case of the French. It's also the case of the Americans, but the French, for tax reasons, of course. and because in a way Portugal became a fashion for some countries. And so they're investing. They're buying their homes there. 1 million of French a year. But with the new flights from and to United States, we hope that your tourism, our tourism, speaking of the Luso-American relationship, is going to increase. It's increasing. It will increase much more in the future. And the dangerous situation in the Mediterranean Sea, in some northern African countries, and even the problems of the refugees and migrations in other southern European countries, are reasons with the security we feel in Portugal for this increase in tourism. Not only a fashion, it could be structural. We must take advantage of this new situation. It's a geopolitical, yes, in a way, but it's also economic. Well, then we must not forget the Atlantic that unites us. And the Atlantic means that, well, things are also improving in a way in Azores and Madeira. And we must be studying. As you know, the oceans are very important for us and for you, for all of us. And we must study common actions in this field of the oceans. So much to do. Of course, we receive other investments and people coming from elsewhere. It's a kind of the example of the Chinese. The Chinese appeared in our energy sector. Now they are becoming stronger in the financial sector. But there are still possibilities for American investment, as you know, being studied and being negotiated. But it's curious that, for instance, in the case of the Chinese, they understood it was a very interesting door in Europe, the Portuguese door. As some Arab countries, also the Emirates. There is a reason. You know our geographic situation. You know our ties with everywhere, all over the world. You know our communities in different continents. We belong to the European Union, but we have in the Portuguese-speaking community states, important states, that after this period of economic challenges they're facing, have an important role to play. In Africa, for instance. Well, I don't speak of that Portuguese-speaking, very strong country, Brazil, but in other continents. So, I'm optimistic. As you know, much more than I do, the world is not facing an easy period of living. No, it isn't. Nowhere. Nowhere. Sometimes we have the feeling that we live in an unpredictable world. In the case of Europe, just think of this. We shall have referenda in Hungary and Italy, elections, who knows, in Spain, in Bulgaria, in France, in the Netherlands, in Germany, for 1 year. And you know what it means economically and politically. I'm optimistic. In spite of the populist, xenophobe trends we see all over the world, in spite of this reality in some, in the European, also in the European space, we really are optimistic. And so, as the President of the Republic of Portugal, I hope that speaking of what has been our relationship, it's increasing little by little in industry, agriculture, in services, but it could improve bilaterally. It could improve. I tried to answer some of your questions, not necessarily all of them, in a very realistic and practical way. It's a way of really representing a country and trying to explain what is happening in that country, that we know it's a beloved country here in the United States, as we really love the United States ever since it became independent.